Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Dan Schnur Political Report, which we wait for with bated breath every month. For those of you who would like to ask questions of Dan, there's a Q&A segment at the bottom of the screen that you can type in your questions. And Rachel Kennardine, our community manager, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion that starts in about 30 minutes. Dan, please join me on screen. We want every second with you to address this great topic today. China, Russia, and NATO, what comes next? But I know you always keep us hopping with input on the latest breaking news. So without further ado, please let me turn this over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Kim. And thanks, as always, to all of you for joining us for our now monthly webinar. Originally, as Kim mentioned, when Rachel and I put our heads together, as we do every month, to come up with the topics for the following month's program, we thought that given the war in Ukraine and given the ongoing challenges that the U.S. faces on the Pacific Rim, we felt that talking about both Russia and China in this webinar would make a lot of sense. But given the events over the last few days, what I've come to believe is that while we will talk about Ukraine quite a bit in the future, as we have talked about it quite a bit in the past, we're going to focus primarily today on China, both on the U.S. relationship there, our challenges going forward, and the events taking place on the Pacific Rim, even as we speak. So there's all sorts of questions around the world we could be considering today. How is the war in Ukraine going? What is the latest in the Middle East? There are new questions arising about U.S. policies that relates to immigration from Latin America and elsewhere. But I feel like the most important question for us to ask on the international stage, and the question we'll use to begin today's program, is simply this: where in the world is Nancy Pelosi? Now, the answer, as all of you know by now, is Pelosi is in Taiwan in the middle of what appears to be a very, very controversial visit to the island of Taiwan, and a visit that is roiling what was already becoming an increasingly tense relationship between the U.S. and China. So in the last week or so, when word about Pelosi's decision to lead a congressional delegation to the Pacific Rim did become public, we learned all sorts of things in the run-up. First of all, we learned that she was beginning her trip in Singapore on Monday, that she'd then go to Malaysia with the delegation. And then later in the week, she would visit Japan and South Korea. And in fact, those trips have all either taken place or are on track to happen in the days ahead. But there was a huge hole in her schedule on Wednesday, and the rumors very quickly began to circulate around Washington and capitals around the world that Pelosi intended to be the first House Speaker, and therefore the highest ranking representative of the US government, to visit Taiwan in over a quarter of a century, since then Speaker Newt Gingrich visited the island way back in the mid-1990s. Now, last week, President Biden was asked about this potential trip, and the president did something he very, very rarely does. He talked about advice that he had received from US military sources. And he said publicly that the US military had told him that now was not a good time for Pelosi to visit Taiwan. And it was widely translated that Biden was delivering that message with the hopes that Pelosi might decide, therefore, not to take the trip. So that's not what happened. But obviously that's not what's happening. So after Biden made those comments publicly, then Chinese government officials began issuing threats about what would happen if she did make a trip to Taiwan. And we'll talk more about those threats and what they mean in just a minute. Then over the weekend, several media outlets in Taiwan reported that the several largest hotels in downtown Taipei had been booked for very large delegations, but without saying who had made those reservations. And then on Saturday, the Chinese military, I think, decided that they'd been able to put two and two together. And on Saturday, the Chinese military announced, with much less notice than usual, that it would conduct drills with live ammunition in the waters off of southeastern Fujian province, which is only about 80 miles from Taiwan. And then on Sunday, just 2 days ago, a spokesman for the Chinese Air Force said that the country's fighter jets would fly around Taiwan in the days ahead to demonstrate its ability to defend that territory should it become necessary. And that, of course, raised the possibility that the exercise would be timed to meet the US Air Force plane that Pelosi and her delegation are taking. So keep in mind, the trip hasn't been officially announced yet. And already President Biden is saying that the military doesn't think it's a good idea. And the Chinese military is talking about exercises in and over and around Taiwan at the same time that Pelosi might come to the island. There was even one Chinese state commentator who said the following, and I'm going to quote on this because I don't want it to be misrepresented. So a Chinese government media representative said, quote, "If US fighter jets escort Pelosi's plane into Taiwan, it is invasion. And our military has the right to forcibly dispel Pelosi's plane and the US fighter jets, including firing warning shots and making tactical movement of obstruction. If ineffective," this is still a quote, "if ineffective, then shoot them down," unquote. Now, US officials were very doubtful that the Chinese military would interfere with Pelosi's ability, her plane's ability to land safely in Taiwan, betting that Beijing doesn't want a direct confrontation like that with the United States. But they did say it was possible that Chinese planes would, quote unquote, escort Mrs. Pelosi's plane as a demonstration of control over the air routes. And that's pretty much what happened. When Pelosi's plane landed in Taipei, Tuesday night Taiwan time, Beijing not only sent airplanes to escort her flight in, but also sent warships to surround the territory. And today, no fewer than 21 Chinese aircraft also entered Taiwan's air defense zone. The White House does, as I said a moment ago, the White House doesn't expect a direct military confrontation. But they are concerned that the largest reaction could come after Pelosi leaves tomorrow, US time, later today, Taiwan time. And that once Pelosi leaves for her stops in South Korea and Japan, then the Chinese military could engage in maneuvers in the Taiwan Strait, in cyber attacks, on communications cutoffs to demonstrate Beijing's ability to choke off the island. So this is how tense things were when Pelosi landed in Taiwan Tuesday night, Taiwan time. And right upon landing, Pelosi immediately spoke out about the importance of supporting Taiwan's democracy and reinforced the point that Biden frequently makes about the important difference and the important choice between democracy and authoritarianism. So upon landing, Pelosi really went out of her way to let the Chinese know that she was not going to be cowed at all by their threats. So that was Tuesday night Taiwan time. Today, it's just past 9 a.m. in the morning there. Today, she's meeting with Chinese political and business leadership. And I know you'll all see the news coverage of that as her trip progresses. Before we go any further, that's what's happening there now. But before we dig in on the pros and cons of this trip, I want to ask you what you think. And so I'm going to ask Katie Gilman, the newest addition to our team, if she can post our first question. Katie, can you put the first question up for our audience? Okay, pretty straightforward, people. I know you know that I normally give multiple choice questions, but this one's pretty straightforward. Should Nancy Pelosi have gone to Taiwan, given the tensions that exist and have now ratcheted up? Pretty simple question, yes or no. There are tensions, there's not been military confrontation, but it is a pretty tricky situation. So Katie, when you have the responses from our group, if you can put them up, that would be great. We can see what our gathering of experts has to say on this particular important question. Should Pelosi have gone to Taiwan or not? How do we do? Okay, there we go. Wow, that is a pretty close decision. It's pretty split. We normally lean pretty heavily, as all of you know, in one direction or another. But 48% of you, less than half, just less than half, think that Pelosi should have gone to Taiwan. 52%, slightly more, said no. Really interesting. And we'll dig into this a little bit more going forward. Now, let's talk about the thinking behind the trip, because there's two main reasons why Pelosi appears to have decided to override the expressions of concerns about the trip expressed by both Biden and the Pentagon. The first is her support for democracy and human rights in China. And by definition, the struggle of the Taiwanese people to fend off Chinese authoritarian aggression, in her words. That's been an important thread throughout her career. And it's worth noting that on her first trip to China, way back in the immediate aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, Pelosi, as a young member of Congress, unfurled a banner expressing her disagreement and condemnation of the Chinese action against the protesters in Tiananmen. And this has been a hallmark of her career, not just since she's been Speaker, but since she first joined Congress. Now, Pelosi, as I think most of you know, originally planned to visit Taiwan back in April, but that got delayed after she got COVID. And it was pretty clear that she didn't want to risk any more delays in making a trip that she saw as very important symbolism for US government support for a key US ally that has been a model of a democracy in Asia. Now, the second reason that Pelosi decided to go forward is that as soon as the news of the trip became public, as I was talking about a few minutes ago, the Chinese government, as I've mentioned, launched a furious campaign to try to convince her not to come, threatening the military action and so on. But that effort, I think the Chinese might have been a bit surprised. The threats were actually counterproductive, because that reaction essentially painted Pelosi and, frankly, the Biden administration into a corner politically, because if she canceled her trip or even delayed it, that would be just red meat for Republicans and other critics who would accuse her and Biden of caving into the Chinese and harming Taiwan's trust in the United States. So once they started threatening her, they couldn't back down. Now, what are the benefits? What are the upsides of her trip to Taiwan? And 48% of you, I think, intuited that there were upsides. For her, for Pelosi, this trip is a capstone to her career, as I was just talking about a moment ago, of promoting democracy and human rights in China. She's been doing this for a long time. And since in all likelihood, she is at or near the end of her career in Congress, this is a very fitting bookend in the eyes of her and her supporters to her original appearance in Taiwan shortly after she was first elected to Congress. So that's the benefit for Pelosi. Now, for Taiwan, there's an immense benefit, because her trip gives Taiwan's struggle to resist Beijing an immense global high-profile media platform to highlight Taiwan as a place where democracy and human rights are important. And this is something we've all known in the past, of course, but no question that her trip is shining a very strong light on those commitments, not just in the US, but around the world. And you can bet that Taiwan's government is hoping that Pelosi's visit will encourage government officials, other government officials from the United States, but also from Europe, from Japan, from South Korea, and from other allies to visit as well, to keep this in the news. But China's mad about this. And the question becomes, as I indicated a moment ago, how bad could this get after Pelosi leaves? Now, it's important to note. So question number 2, perfect, thank you, Katie. So do you think, based on what we now know, not only do you think is it a good or bad idea, but second question, will Pelosi's visit help or hurt the US presence in the Pacific Rim? And once again, this is a pretty straightforward question. Do you think her going will help by shining a light on democracy and highlighting the US relationship with Taiwan? And keep in mind that Joe Biden, not once, not twice, but 3 times, has indicated since taking office as president, that he, as president, would deploy US military in defense of Taiwan if China were to act aggressively against the island. So will this visit help in that regard? Will it hurt by raising tensions in the way we've talked a minute ago? Or will it really not make much difference? So Katie, once we've got those answers, let's go ahead and put them up. And I'll be very interested to see whether they're much different than what we heard on the first question. Oh, look at that, much different. How about that? For our group was slightly against Pelosi going to Taiwan, 48 to 52. That 48% might even be the same people still think that the trip will help the US presence in the Pacific Rim. 22% say it'll hurt. 30% say it won't make a difference. So it seems like most of you who didn't think the trip was a good idea might not have liked it, but don't think it'll be a big deal once all is said and done. Boy, that's really interesting. That's really interesting data. So let's talk a little bit about China's potential reaction after Pelosi leaves. So as I mentioned earlier, it's important to remember that congressional delegations have been visiting Taiwan for decades, going all the way, including the one that Gingrich took way back in the 1990s. And most of the time, the Chinese rarely even bother to mention it. But this is different. And it reflects, in my mind, how Beijing is seeking to move the goalposts of what's considered to be acceptable US engagement with Taiwan. In other words, for reasons we'll talk about in just a moment, Beijing doesn't want the status quo anymore, where the US relationship with Taiwan is as strong as it's been for many decades. They want to try to discourage the United States from even keeping that relationship where it's been. So why is that? Well, for a few reasons. Since 2013, for almost a decade now, the Chinese leadership has made what they called a peaceful reunification with Taiwan a key part of their leadership platform. And we're getting very close to the Chinese Communist Party's what's called their Party Congress this fall. And at that Party Congress, the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, is going to seek what's considered to be an unprecedented third fifth-year term as China's president. And he doesn't want to look weak compared to the US as he heads into such an important point in his own career. And some of it's personal. The Chinese leadership doesn't like Pelosi, given her history of advocating for human rights and democracy in China. And so they wanted to actually raise their concerns in order to push back at Pelosi personally. But there's other things going on too. The Chinese economy is really struggling. China's had yet another outbreak of COVID and is still struggling to develop its own vaccines. So what the country's leadership is doing is what government leaders do in most countries when domestic challenges begin to hurt them politically. They look to distract, they look to change the subject. And by engaging in a very visible and forceful nationalist pushback against high-ranking US government officials, the Chinese government leadership is hoping that this takes public attention away from their health and economic concerns and turns this into a bigger issue, this confrontation into a bigger issue in their minds. One last thing, Pelosi's trip is happening at the peak of China's annual military training cycle. And just yesterday was the annual holiday which separated their People's Liberation Army. And so sending a high-ranking government official from the US to Taiwan right in the middle of such important dates on the Chinese calendar when they're honoring their military, that looks like an intentional affront, even if that's not the case. Now I'm going to talk to you about one other thing that I saw just this morning. And for those of you who haven't read it, I would very, very strongly encourage you to read the column in the New York Times written by their very fine columnist, Tom Friedman, this morning about Pelosi's trip to China. And I'm going to read you just a little bit of an excerpt from it. Friedman says the following. He said, "I have a lot of respect for House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, but if she does go ahead with a visit to Taiwan this week, obviously written before the trip, against President Biden's wishes, she will be doing something that is utterly reckless, dangerous, and irresponsible," unquote. And that comes from Friedman. And the reason he wrote this column, this is very interesting information which had not been previously reported until this morning, is Friedman reported that the reason that Biden is against the trip is because of its impact not on the US relationship with China, but primarily because of US interests in Ukraine and the confrontation there against Russia. So Biden and his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, and you really should read this column, have been talking recently with China's leaders, including Biden's conversation more than 2 hours long last week with the Chinese president. And what they've been saying over and over again, Biden and Sullivan and the rest of Biden's national security advisors have been trying to discourage Beijing from getting involved in Ukraine on Russia's side, basically telling them that if they provide military assistance to Russia, that will dramatically hurt China's ability to engage in free trade with the US and from Europe. And given China's economic problems, it relies very heavily on international trade, and the United States and the European Union are two of their most important markets. So what Biden and his team know is that Putin really does desperately need now. He needs military equipment of the type that China produces. And Biden has been trying to convince the US government has been trying to convince its Chinese counterparts, stay out of Russia, or it's going to make your economy even worse. And so it's Friedman's concern that by taking the trip, Pelosi might undermine Biden and might actually encourage the Chinese government to engage more forcefully on Russia's behalf in support of Russia in Ukraine than it has to date. Now, I'm not sure if I believe that or not, but it's a fascinating argument. It's one I hadn't heard before, and I'd be very surprised and very impressed if many of you had heard that argument before Friedman wrote it this morning. So what I'd like to do now is something we haven't done that often, but I think it's an important thing to do in this circumstance. Katie, if you can, I'm going to ask you to go back and put question 1 up again about whether people think Pelosi's visit was a good idea or not. Because like me, you've now heard a very strong argument against the trip from a very respected foreign policy voice in Tom Friedman. Now, again, like I said earlier, I don't know if Friedman is correct in his assessment. I don't know if China will respond in that way because its economic concerns still are paramount. And on one hand, it may be they can still engage in some saber rattling, as they've been doing and will do over the next several days. But maybe the Chinese government leadership doesn't want to hurt its economic interests any more after Pelosi's visit than they would have previously, given the warnings they've received from Biden and Blinken and the Biden administration. So I'm not really sure what to think about the Friedman article. I'm not really sure whether it changes my mind on Pelosi's visit. But Katie, let's see if our group has changed their thinking at all based on that new information. 41% yes, 59% no. Support for the trip has dropped a little bit, but not a tremendous amount. So like me, it sounds like many of you are figuring Friedman's thinking into your own calculations, but not necessarily changing your opinion because of them. And so then, Katie, if we can, let's put up the second question we asked again about the impact of the visit and see if that changes people's minds. So it's now question 4. There we go. So we asked you this a little earlier. So now do you think, based on what I've told you from Friedman's assessment, do you think Pelosi's visit to Taiwan will help or hurt the US presence in the Pacific Rim? Now, Friedman, of course, is written about Ukraine, not about the Pacific Rim directly. But I think the broader question still holds. Do you have any more concern based on what you've heard from Friedman about Pelosi's decision to go and think that it might hurt US interests? Or do you think that, well, I guess, do you think that the visit will still help based on what many of you said before? Or once again, that it won't make any difference? And let's see what kind of answer we got to this one. Also a bit of a shift. So not immense changes on each one, but I'm glad that all of you, or most of you, are willing to take in new information when you get it and process it in your thinking. We'll find out in the weeks and probably months ahead about whether Friedman's right. We'll see if Pelosi's visit does encourage China to become more militarily involved in Ukraine. But it is interesting now seeing Friedman's reporting to understand why Biden felt it necessary to speak out in public last week, because he really does believe, of course, that keeping China sidelined and out of the Ukraine conflict is paramount to that country's ability to win its war against Russia, and for the US and its Western allies to be able to maintain its support for those efforts. Now, more broadly, if you think about Europe as it relates not just to Russia and Ukraine, but to China, I'll offer you this. So EU officials have been very reluctant to weigh into this dispute over Taiwan in public, not just around this visit, but for months and years, Europe's wanted to stay out of this one. Because on one hand, Europe has always seen the economic benefits of increased free trade with China. On the other hand, they are very wary of China's international goals. And what they've decided in recent days is a lot of European diplomats now see that there's a danger that the Taiwan situation could spiral out of control, in addition to a problem, a crisis in Ukraine that would have one on the Pacific Rim on Taiwan as well. But more than Pelosi's trip, what got Europe thinking about getting more seriously involved in support of the US as it relates to Taiwan does relate to Ukraine. Because you may remember that just before the war in Ukraine broke out, just before Russia invaded, China's and Russia's leaders had a summit at which China pledged, or you may remember, a no limits partnership with Russia. And between that no limits partnership announcement and the fact that China has at least been rhetorically supporting Russia in Ukraine has made Europe increasingly nervous. And so we will next month, of course, talk much more about the Ukraine war. But it is worth noting how the interrelationship between the two has taken Europe from a position of being very welcoming to Chinese investment to now being much more worried about it. And I think going forward, I think we worried at the outset of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, would this make China more or less likely to engage forcefully in Taiwan? And it now appears that China does see this as a particularly good opportunity, not necessarily to invade, and we'll talk in just a minute why that may or may not happen anytime soon. But if not actually to invade, why China would begin to move more aggressively in terms of flights and warships and such in the areas surrounding Taiwan, because they feel that the United States and NATO are distracted and are paying so much attention to Eastern Europe that they might not have the wherewithal to pay as much attention to Chinese aggression in the Pacific Rim. On one hand, so I guess I should back up for a second. Let's take a moment before we go to your questions. Let's take a minute to think about what happens if this does escalate. That if after Pelosi leaves, if China does begin to move more forcefully, if not against Taiwan itself, in the immediate air and waters surrounding the island. On one hand, it's possible that just as our US intelligence sources overestimated Russia's military, the concern is that they might be underestimating China's military. On the other hand, it's worth noting that Russia had been upgrading its military capability for many years now, and that they'd been testing new weapon systems in Syria and elsewhere for quite a few years. China, on the other hand, China has not fought in a war since 1979, and its Air Force hasn't participated in a major conflict since 1958. So it's worth at least raising the question about whether, even though the Chinese would like to take advantage of this opportunity, and while reunification with Taiwan is a stated goal of the Chinese government, if a full-on invasion is in their best interest, or just these smaller steps of aggression, which hopefully won't require a full US and Western response, is a more appropriate way to move toward their goal. So now, whether China were to invade at some point, or to continue to just edge closer, as I said earlier, President Biden has made it clear 3 times now that if Taiwan were attacked by China, that the US would defend militarily. So our last question for all of you today, before I ask Rachel to join me, is, should the US defend Taiwan militarily if Taiwan is attacked? And the options here are, there's 3 of them. Yes, we should defend Taiwan, but only as part of an international coalition. Second, yes, we should defend Taiwan, as Biden has suggested, but even if our allies are not willing to be part of that defense, the US should stand up to China unilaterally in order to protect Taiwan and democratic interests in the Pacific Rim. Or third and finally, do you just think that even if China were to attack Taiwan militarily, the US should not defend, and the diplomatic and other efforts should take preference? And so, Katie, once we have this answer, let's see what everybody has to say. Well, look at that. Only 9%, and this is a group that tends to be pretty anti-war, I've learned from our past months of getting together. Only 9%, less than 1 out of every 10 of you, say that the US should not defend Taiwan military if that island were attacked. 64%, almost 2/3 of you, say that we should do it, but only as part of a coalition. But more than a quarter, 27%, say even unilaterally. But add that all up, and 91% of our group believes that the US has an obligation to defend Taiwan should it become necessary. Very interesting. Now, one of the things we'll need to talk about in the future are other Chinese goals in the world. Their goals in Latin America, their goals in Africa and the Middle East, and of course, the nature of their evolving relationship with Russia. But today, I think we'll skip over those things, at least for now, because now that we're at the bottom of the hour, what I want to do is get to my favorite part of the program, where Rachel joins me. And instead of me just talking on and on, I get to answer some of your questions. And as always, Rachel, I'm going to guess that we have a pretty serious number of questions that have already come in. Am I right?
Hi, Dan. Yes, we do. I know that this is such a very important topic right now, and things are very tense. So we really appreciate you taking the time to talk about it. And we do have a ton of questions, so really excited to get to those. Before we do that, I just wanted to say I was really struck by the poll results from earlier. The change from the first time that we asked them to the second was, I think, really striking. And I agree with your assessment that I'm glad that people are willing to take in new information.
Yeah, the Friedman column was fascinating. And again, we don't know for certain whether things will play out as he suggests and as he's concerned might be the case. But I agree with you completely, Rachel. It is worth noting our audience does take the opinions of a respected analyst like Friedman very seriously. So what else did we hear from our group?
Yeah, so to kick off, we obviously had a ton of questions about Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So the first that I'd like to ask is, what is the advice that Pelosi not go to Taiwan based on? Is it that Taiwan is outmanned and outgunned compared to the Chinese military?
I think it has less to do with the military balance between US and China, but more to do with the idea that while Pelosi would be making a strong public statement in favor of democracy, which most people would support, that she would unnecessarily raise tensions that are already very high between China and the United States. Yeah, we're having difficulties with China over trade and economic issues, over international property issues, over military national security issues in the South China Sea, over human rights and democracy challenges in Hong Kong, in Northwest China, and potentially in Taiwan. And so those who argue against it have suggested that while it's always good to make a strong point, if it takes a tense situation, makes it worse, that's not necessarily a good thing to do. And of course, Frieden's argument suggests that part of those tensions might include China getting involved more forcefully in support of Russia in Ukraine.
Thank you, Dan. Another question that related to Pelosi's visit from our audience was Pelosi's flight routing, which avoided the South China Sea, A, to avoid the small chance of being shot down, or B, a signal to Beijing that her visit was an overt finger in China's eye?
Great question, and a very sophisticated question. I don't pretend to know that answer for sure, but I'll take a somewhat educated guess that it was much more the second option than the first. My guess is that US military did suggest that the flight be taken on a less provocative route for the reasons that the first option indicated. But I also do believe that the US government felt that China was not going to risk a full-on military confrontation over this. And while there are some flyovers and movings of ships and so on, that they weren't going to directly engage with the aircraft of the third ranking official in the US government. And if you assume, as do I, and as I think the questioner does, that the concept of Pelosi's visit from the beginning is to stick a finger in the eye of the Chinese leadership, this simply exacerbated it. So more communications and messaging than military safety, but probably some of both.
Great, thank you so much. Another audience member asked, what movement, if any, are you aware of in terms of strategic US Air Force hardware and US Navy vessels? Is the US making any moves in response to China's increase in presence around Taiwan?
And in fact, the answer is yes. Not only over the last several weeks and months has the United States shored up its presence in that region, but in the days leading up to that trip, US ships that have been based elsewhere in the general region have been moved somewhat closer to Taiwan. Again, the assumption is that the Chinese would not want to risk a full-on military conflict, but that if such a thing were to take place, the US military and the White House wanted to be in a position, should it be necessary, to have sufficient resources at hand to protect and, if necessary, rescue Pelosi and other US interests in Taiwan. So I don't know of anyone who felt this was a likely occurrence, but simply a smart precaution to take under the circumstances to do some logistical adjustments to make that kind of engagement necessary, possible, if it actually did become necessary.
Definitely. Thank you, Dan. Another audience member asked, in addition to the foreign policy issues raised by the speaker's trip, what impact does it have on Biden politically, since he was not able to control someone in his own party in a complex and critical area of foreign policy?
What also a really good question, and I will admit that that was something that I thought about when Biden first made the public comments. Because on one hand, it was clear, as I talked about earlier, that once the Chinese began to issue threats, it was very unlikely that Pelosi was going to back down. And what that meant is by going public, Biden was almost certainly going to look very weak politically. That if a Democratic president can't convince a Democratic Speaker of the House, a member of his own party with whom he has presumably fairly good relationships, couldn't convince her not to go, that does raise into question Biden's strength. So the question then becomes, why would he do it? And the answer, at least possibly, comes from Friedman's column, that he was so concerned about Pelosi's trip causing a change in the nature of the Ukraine conflict that he decided it was worth taking a step like that in hopes of changing her mind, even though he felt it was unlikely.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. We also had a number of questions come in about China's reaction to Pelosi's trip. So one questioner asks, how do you think a Chinese takeover of Taiwan would differ from what they have done in Hong Kong after the military aspect of the conflict has passed?
Okay. Well, I think it's worth thinking about the history of Hong Kong and Taiwan vis-a-vis mainland China. Hong Kong, of course, had been a British province for many, many years before it was returned to China based on an agreement that those two countries, Great Britain and China, made some years ago. Taiwan, of course, on the other hand, known back in the mid-20th century as Formosa, was the island to which the nationalist Chinese retreated after losing the Civil War to the Chinese communists when they took over control of that country in the mid-20th century. So when Chiang Kai-shek and the other Chinese nationalists fled to then Formosa, now Taiwan, the country of China, while at some point it liked the idea of claiming control over Hong Kong, Taiwan is much more of a matter of national pride. And many of their leaders, including their president, believe it's a matter of national destiny. Hong Kong, they officially recognized, happily or not, as a part of the British Empire for a period of time. But China, of course, has never recognized Taiwan as an independent country because they believe that it is part of them. So the emotions run a lot higher. And if Taiwan and China were reunified at some point in the future, peacefully or otherwise, it's worth assuming that the Chinese takeover of Taiwan would be much, much harsher than what we've seen in Hong Kong in recent months.
Thanks, Dan. Definitely an interesting one to think about. Another question about China's reaction and kind of the purpose of Pelosi's visit came from an audience member who asked, one policy and military expert expressed the view that distracting China's attention away from Russia and Ukraine would be helpful. What are your thoughts on that claim?
Well, it's been a question that's been asked fairly regularly since the outbreak of the hostilities in Ukraine. And there's been two schools of thought. The first, as we talked about earlier, is that China might see this as an opportunity to begin to move somewhat more aggressively, not just on Taiwan, but in its own Northwest region and elsewhere in the Pacific Rim, given the amount of time and attention and focus that the US and the West have been putting into Ukraine. The contrary argument, which arose in the first weeks after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that this might actually give China some pause and make them more hesitant to assert itself militarily in the Pacific Rim. The thinking being, if you remember when the Ukraine war first broke out, there were a lot of doubts around the world about whether the US would be able to successfully marshal an alliance with Western interests, with Europe, with NATO, and with other allies to stand up together on behalf of the Ukraine. And frankly, NATO and US other allies were much more effective in that unified effort than a lot of people expected. So the question was, would Chinese government leaders look at the way the West unified on behalf of Ukraine and say, wow, they're coming together better on that than we thought. Does that mean that we would have to face a more unified Western resistance if we were to move on Taiwan? And I have to tell you, Rachel, based on our audience's response to the question about the United States defending Taiwan a few minutes ago, the Chinese might have something plausible to worry about. So we really don't know the answer. Is Ukraine a distraction that gives China more maneuverability? Or is Ukraine proof that the pushback against Chinese aggression might be more forceful in a more united front than they anticipated? I don't think we know the answer to that. And one of the things we were going to talk about today before Pelosi's trip, and I guess we'll have to talk about next month, is how well the US Western alliance can hold together on behalf of Ukraine as we move into the colder winter months in Europe. And Russia's moved very aggressively to restrict energy resources into Europe. There's been all sorts of controversy over their reduction of oil flow through the Gazprom pipeline. We still don't know if Saudi Arabia and OPEC are going to be providing significantly more oil to Europe, or whether the Biden administration may continue to try to increase US output to help Europe through a tough winter. But this united Western front in Ukraine is about to be tested in a very difficult way in the upcoming winter months. And I suspect China is going to be watching that very, very carefully before they make a decision on whether or how to move on Taiwan.
I completely agree with you, Dan, and I'm really looking forward to talking more about that next month as well.
We've also got to talk about the midterm elections. We've got a lot to talk
Yes,
about.
we do. Much to cover. So another popular topic in our audience questions was about the economic implications of Taiwan, our relationship with Taiwan, as well as China's. So one audience member asked, with the worldwide semiconductor shortage, what is the Chinese government's calculation on the potential impact to their economy if they invade or take dramatic military action, which shuts down Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing output?
Boy, I really, really like our audience, Rachel. I have to tell you, these are such smart questions. And as many of you probably know, because you are a really well-informed group, startlingly so, if you don't mind me saying so, is most or all of you know that the US Congress has moved to pass a very significant funding bill to provide financial resources to dramatically increase US production of these very important semiconductors. And one of the ways that the Biden administration was able to convince a lot of reluctant members of Congress, both in the Democrat and the Republican Party, to sign on to the semiconductor funding bill was to talk about the specter of China and the real threat of China controlling that marketplace. Now, Taiwan, of course, in the questioner referred to this, Taiwan is the world's largest manufacturer of these semiconductors. And aside from all the geopolitical problems that would exist if China were to assume control over Taiwan, those semiconductors, which power almost everything in our society today, our cars, our planes, our computers, everything, if China were able to assume control over the output of those semiconductors, that could have catastrophic effects, not just on the US and Western economies, but on the way we lead our daily lives. So protecting China for reasons relating to democracy and human rights are important, but there's sheer economic and quality of life interest too. With semiconductors, it's one of the reasons that the US is rushing to pass this bill. But it is worth noting, and while this was a tremendous bipartisan victory that Biden achieved by getting Congress to pass legislation providing so much more funding for US-based manufacturing, it takes a while to build those factories. It takes a while to train those workers. And so, in fact, the US semiconductor production output is probably not going to increase for several years yet, which means our reliance on Taiwan is going to be very great for the foreseeable future, even as we prepare to increase our own capability. So this is a critically important part of the China-Taiwan equation, and I'm really glad the questioner raised it.
Yeah, me too. And you actually answered part of the next question as well, but I'll ask the part that you didn't answer. So one of our audience members also noted the bipartisan effort for this $52 billion US-made semiconductor bill, but also noted that Mitch McConnell could block it. So the audience member asked, what is his reasoning? And if it passes, will we eventually be able to compete with Taiwan?
Okay, so McConnell voted against the bill because he believed that the money was not being spent wisely. The Republicans who voted against the bill did so because they don't like the idea of the government picking private sector winners and losers. The Democrats who oppose the bill generally do so because they don't like the idea of providing what they would call bailouts to very large US corporations. But McConnell and his allies in the Senate voted against the bill, not for private public sector reasons, not because they failed to recognize the threat. I suspect that if McConnell had wanted to keep it from reaching the 60 vote threshold, he might have been able to push much, much harder. But it appeared, at least, that while he was voting no, he didn't expect a great deal of effort or energy to try to convince Republican senators to vote against it. And more than enough members of the Senate Republican caucus did vote for it to allow it to pass with room to spare.
Great, thank you, Dan. One further question about this topic, which isn't directly related to the Taiwan specifically, but I thought was really interesting. The audience member asked, does economic interdependence make the world safer?
Does economic interdependence make the world safer? I think it does. And for those of you who participated in these webinars over the last couple of years now, I think most of you know that while I try to leave my own politics out of these discussions, I think you've all been able to see that I am a pretty avowed free trader. And I do believe that increased economic interaction between countries is not only good for the economies of those countries, because it lowers the prices of goods and if done right, can provide incentives for workers. But I think it also has diplomatic and security benefits as well, because two countries that are trading with each other, even if they disagree on some matter of security, they're more likely to try to resolve that disagreement diplomatically because they don't want to harm their own country's economic interests. And once again, this was the basis of the argument that Tom Friedman was making in his column. What Joe Biden and his advisors were telling China over the last several weeks is that even if you're tempted to engage militarily in support of Russia and Ukraine, it will hurt you economically. And the Chinese leadership is smart enough to understand that undue economic pain for their constituents isn't good for the country or for their political leadership. So I think the questioner calls it economic interdependence. I call it increased economic trade is good not just for the economic livelihoods of the people in those countries, but I think it also helps from a diplomatic and security standpoint as well. Great,
thank you, Dan. Going a little bit off tonight's topic, but what I thought was another really interesting question from the audience. One person asked, around 7 in 10 Americans said that they did not want Biden to run for president again in 2024. Will he listen when the time to announce comes, and who else is available to run?
We really are going to have to do a program on the midterm elections pretty soon. As many of you know, there's critical primaries taking place today in Arizona and Missouri and in other states around the country. And we've talked many times over the course of the year about how important the elections are in November for control of both the House and the Senate. So one outgrowth of that discussion are Biden's own political prospects. And it is fairly clear that the Democratic Party has cooled on Biden. And it's sort of curious if you stop and think about it. When Joe Biden ran for president in 2020, the party turned to him, even though many party regulars were more progressive than Biden, and in their hearts were more likely to support someone like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. But ultimately, they nominated Biden, among other reasons, because they felt that a more centrist establishment candidate was better positioned to defeat Donald Trump. So here we are a couple years later, and that centrist establishment candidate has turned into a centrist establishment president. And you have a lot of progressives who are upset about that. But of course, they voted for him in order to defeat Trump. Will Trump run for a president again in 2024? We have no way of knowing or predicting. But as long as the possibility exists, and as long as Trump himself stokes that speculation, Biden, I think, still remains the Democrats' best hope of defeating Trump, should Trump run again. If Trump does not run again, I think it's entirely possible that Biden might decide not to. And at that point, not only would Vice President Harris almost certainly enter the race, but so would other members of the Biden administration, most notably the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, and possibly the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo. Our own governor here in California, Gavin Newsom, has sworn that he has never given a single nanosecond's thought to running for president, which would be weird for the governor of California, but I'll take him at his word. And plus, if you remember back to 2020, Rachel, there were almost 24 other Democrats who ran for president. And almost all of them, my guess is, would think seriously about running again. So if Biden didn't, in addition to Harris and Buttigieg and Newsom, expect that you would see Beto O'Rourke and Cory Booker and Amy Klobuchar and all those others who ran back in 2020. But I do think that as 2024 draws closer, particularly if Trump does look like a potential candidate, I think that many of the Democrats who say that they would prefer another candidate are likely to come back to Biden the same way they did in 2020, even though in their hearts they might have preferred somebody else then.
Thank you, Dan. Great analysis. And yes, we'll definitely have to talk about the midterms soon.
We have a lot to cover this fall.
Yes, we do. For our final question, I wanted to just come back for our topic for the evening because we got a pretty recent question that I thought was great. So the audience member asks, what are Australia, Japan, and the ASEAN countries saying publicly about Pelosi's visit and their willingness to respond militarily if China attacks Taiwan?
Well, yet another good question. And most of the U.S. allies in the Pacific Rim generally keep pretty quiet on these questions. Australia has spoken out from time to time, not so much specifically on Pelosi's trip, but more broadly on what they see is inappropriate Chinese behavior in the region. And China has responded very forcefully against Australia, not militarily, but in terms of economic sanctions, withholding trade possibilities, and that sort of thing. One of the most notable diplomatic efforts that's taken place under Biden has been the strengthening and broadening of the purpose of what's known as the Quad. And the Quad is an alliance between the US, Australia, Japan, and India. And although it is not spoken publicly all that much, all four of those countries have different types of concerns about China. And while the alliance exists for a lot of reasons, it's generally considered to be sort of a counterweight to China's presence in the Pacific Rim. Though, for the most part, the leaders of other Pacific Rim countries have been very excited about welcoming Pelosi to their country, but haven't really said that much about her trip to Taiwan, simply because it isn't in their direct interests. And if Biden is able to fulfill his goal of continuing to strengthen U.S. relationships on the Pacific Rim, perhaps they'd be willing to become more vocal in future years. But I think this is one of the consequences we pay as a country for having let those relationships wither in the past. And while a lot of that occurred under Donald Trump, it's notable that the Biden administration is not pursuing nearly as aggressive trade relationships with these Asian countries, the same way that the Obama and Clinton administrations did in their day. And I think that makes these countries more hesitant to weigh in on questions like this one. So the short version of that long answer is they are cheering us on, but very, very quietly.
Thank you so much, Dan. And that was a great way to wrap up the program. So I'll go ahead and ask Kim to come back on, but just thank you as always for answering those questions. I know our audience appreciates them and we always have so many come in, so thanks.
Well, and thank you, Rachel, for helping me navigate all of these questions. As always, I really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Yes, of course.
Great job, Rachel. And thank you, Katie, who's been with us all of 4 weeks now. We've got a great team. Dan, you always, as always, help us navigate these very complicated issues. And we look forward to it every month. So let's do a plug for your next program on September 6th. So we will be working hard to pull a phenomenal, how do you put all of the topics that you want to cover today?
Well, I felt bad about leaving Russia out for people who tuned in planning to hear about China and Russia. I apologize for that, but please blame Speaker Pelosi, because I think she forced our hand on this one. This was such an important news item that I think you'd agree, Kim, it was worth focusing our attention on, primarily, if not exclusively. And of course, our September program will be the day after Labor Day, which is the traditional campaign kickoff. So while we certainly really do need to talk about Russia and Ukraine again, we've gone a couple months without that conversation. Once the campaign gets underway, that's obviously going to be something I know our group's going to want to talk a lot about.
Absolutely.
So we will have a lot to cover throughout the fall.
And we always have your after the webinar session. For those of you who would like to speak with Dan directly, that's a very lively discussion. So all members welcome. So let us know and we'll be happy to get you all signed up. So thank you again, Dan.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks everyone for joining us. As always, we really appreciate it.
My team is really working hard to curate a terrific lineup for all of you of in-person and live streaming programs for the fall. So we'll start posting all of our fall programming in the next few weeks. In addition to Dan's program on September 6th, we're also launching a breakfast author series. Many of you remember the Akasha Cafe. And so we're going to start that again on September 23rd with author Tim Schumann, who is author of the book Always Faithful. This is a just terrific story of the unshakable bond between a Marine in Afghanistan and his interpreters. So stay tuned and keep watching for those postings on our website. So thanks again, Dan, and everybody take care, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.